Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Mercer. I teach philosophy here at St. Mary's University. Christina Bamey teaches in the philosophy department of Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Surrey, British Columbia. She earned her PhD from Dalhousie University in 2014. Like most good philosophers, Christina is interested in just about everything. Her area of specialization is philosophy of language and philosophy of linguistics, but she's done work in epistemology, philosophy of mind, evolutionary theory, and the history of philosophy, Plato and Descartes in particular. Christina is also very interested in the state of contemporary universities and other matters of culture. She's written articles and given presentations concerning censorship, self-censorship, academic freedom, collegiality, and other topics. Recordings of her presentations are available on the website of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, and I urge you to go watch one or two of them when you get a chance. Christina's talk today is entitled Weaponizing Empathy. And as you'll notice, Christina was the 2024 recipient of the Faculty of Arts Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Award at Kwantlen University. So help me welcome Christina Bamey.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I just wanted to say invitation. Yes, so I will be talking about some of the more pernicious problems with how empathy has been used recently. Okay, so I will talk. I should say this is a little bit a repetition of a talk I gave, I think it was in January, that got rudely interrupted by a fire alarm. So I'm proudly telling everybody now that I got cancelled when I was at SMU. Right, so I will talk a little bit about rage farming and then go to empathy farming. I will quickly go again through what is empathy, what is lack of empathy, and why there are problems. And I have added a little bit about the recent controversies in the Israel-Hamas conflict that unfortunately also affected the Society of Academic Freedom and Scholarship in a way that I really didn't anticipate. So rage farming, of course, we are told is a horrible thing. It's everywhere. It's a manipulative tactic to elicit outrage with the goal of increasing internet traffic, online engagement, revenue, and support. The outrage of the person being provoked is farmed or manipulated into an online engagement that helps amplify the message of the original creator. The use of the tactic of rage farming was on the rise, with right-wing politicians employing the technique by promoting conspiracy theories and misinformation. Good thing that nobody on the political left is ever doing something like that, yes. But oh well. Now, a very recent example of that, where something was put on the internet without confirmation, was yesterday. It was announced that Noam Chomsky has died. And then his wife actually spoke up and said, no, he didn't die yet. Of course, the guy is 95. He had a massive stroke last year. So it was unsurprising that virtually everybody believed the first announcement. And then there was a huge backlash. And some people were remarking on the death and resurrection of Chomsky all within an hour or so. So yes, it does happen, and not always for political reasons, but usually when we are talking in the university context about rage farming, it is about politically motivated, and usually it is kind of alleged that the conservatives are doing all the bad stuff. So for instance, last year, July 10, Danielle Smith and Pierre Poilievre posted at Stampede with a man wearing a bright green shirt advocating for straight pride, and everybody went ballistic about that. I leave it up to you to decide how outrageous that actually is.
It's fine.
Right. September 23, Poilievre posted on Facebook, "Why are groceries so much cheaper in the States than in Canada? 2 words, Justin Trudeau, axe the tax, bring home affordable food." Apparently that is rage farming, and a lot of the other announcements that Poilievre made since then. And surprisingly, it seems to be effective because Trudeau just can't recover, it seems. And then there was this infamous example of what's his name, Jeffrey Epstein's exploits. Now, the interesting thing is that something very similar has happened when it comes to empathy. So first of all, we probably should ask, what is empathy? There are different types of empathy. Cognitive empathy is also known as perspective taking. Cognitive empathy relies on the listener's capacity to relate to another person's perspective without imposing their own experience, point of view, or bias. And as I shall argue, that is actually extremely difficult. Then there is compassionate empathy, that is a hybrid of cognitive and emotional empathy. Compassionate empathy requires analyzing the underlying cause and effect of a situation. After someone explains their circumstances, you can demonstrate that you understand the situation on some level in an unbiased manner. And obviously the emphasis here is on the unbiased manner. Finally, there is emotional empathy. An emotionally empathetic person can mirror another's struggles. Sorry. This means they can care for another's well-being through shared experience of emotional situations. Very often what comes to mind is like parents caring for their kids, and of course they share in the emotion of their kids. So if a kid is emotionally distraught, so is the parent. And while this might work to some extent with parents and children, it's actually extremely difficult for grown-ups, or so I will argue. Before I get there, lack of empathy is something that is considered to be something bad. So it is an inability to understand others. A person who lacks empathy may struggle to understand other people's feelings, problems, or life situations. And here I'm not talking about people that have some cognitive impairment, that have something like Down syndrome or stuff like that, but your average Joe. Difficulty regulating emotions. Someone who lacks empathy often has a hard time understanding or regulating their own emotions. So it's not just how to relate to others, but also how to express themselves. Very often people who lack empathy are prone to criticize excessively others, and they also tend to be on the impatient side. And just to continue with all the bad things about lacking empathy, minimal forgiveness. So it is argued that in order to forgive another person, you actually have to empathize with them. Otherwise you can't. Again, we can probably talk about whether or not that is actually the case. Poor listening skills, self-centeredness, and victim blaming. And causes of lack of empathy, we also had, I'm pretty sure we got that far last time, so again I will go a little bit faster through this. Personality disorders, autism spectrum disorder, lack of awareness. Many people who lack empathy simply don't realize it and therefore haven't spent time and energy working to develop empathy. Self-awareness is a key towards empathy. Lack of role models. So obviously if you grew up in, oh, thank you. If you grew up in a household where you didn't experience any empathy, then you are likely not to be a very empathetic person either. So how can one deal with that if it's such a bad thing? First, one can address it directly, so especially if a person is unaware that they lack empathy, then simply pointing it out to them might actually be quite helpful. Model empathetic behavior, so instead of criticizing people, showing them what you expect them to do, and so on. So this is all very nice. Practice identifying emotions. So it is actually well known that a lot of people have a hard time identifying their own emotions. So they know that they feel somehow bad, but they don't really can pinpoint, am I angry, am I frustrated, am I exasperated, that kind of stuff. And finally, recommend professional help. Okay. It seems that there is no I in empathy, because the whole idea is when I empathize with Mike, for instance, I'm trying to put myself in Mike's shoes. And as long as I'm Christina, that gets in the way of being truly empathetic. But what am I actually doing when I attempt this perspective taking? Can I truly relate to another person's perspective without imposing my own experience, point of view, or biases? This was actually a really nice example here. So Mike was listening to me coughing, was thinking what would help me if I have this kind of a cough, and then he went and got me something to drink.
No, what would enable me not to have to hear your cough?
But even there, you had to figure out what might make me stop. And so you thought, well, if I have a cough, So yes, it can be absolutely selfish. You're actually right. It can be absolutely selfish. I don't want to hear this cough anymore. So what am I going to do when I have a cough? That should work for her as well. And in quite a few cases, yes, that's actually effective. However, it doesn't always work that way, because we are not always that kind of uniform. So when I'm attempting to understand someone else's situation on some level in an unbiased manner, I am not understanding their situation. Rather, I imagine what I would do if I were in their situation. So what would I do if I had this kind of cough? I would drink some water. So I want her to stop, therefore I offer her water. So you're not doing it because you're a nice guy, but the result is essentially the same. There are actually no truly shared emotional experiences. I never can truly know what it is to be in another person's situation. They may be weaker than me, stronger than me. I could have some really rare allergy towards ice cubes, and things could get a whole lot worse. But yes, so we take a good guess, and obviously in some situations it works, in others it doesn't. But it doesn't really mean when we're successful that we now know what it's like to be that other person. Pain empathy is a prime example. So one person, often a mother, claims to literally feel the pain of another person, usually her child. So you probably all can think of examples. You see a little child running and then falling and skinning their knees, starting to cry, and parents almost physically feel the pain of their kids. Of course, they don't really feel the pain of their kids. They remember a situation where they were in intense pain in a similar situation. So that is what pain empathy is. So mirror neurons are implicated in that. They fire both when we do experience something and when we observe someone else doing and experiencing the same thing. So the mother doesn't really feel her child's pain. When her mirror neurons fire, she literally feels pain, but it is her own pain, triggered by observing her child being in pain. Now, obviously, in this particular case, it really doesn't matter. The outcome is the same. The mom will do something to ease the pain of her child. But especially in recent times, we have gone out of our way to understand the pain of oppressed people. And one way, allegedly, to do that is feeling strong empathy for oppressed people, because it then would motivate us to do something to help and support them. So to end their pain. But can we actually understand what it's like to be oppressed if we are not member of an oppressed group, or more broadly speaking, if we have never experienced oppression ourselves? So now we would be in a situation, to get back to this example, Mike hears me coughing and really wants me to shut up, but he has never experienced a cough himself. And so he has no idea what might be helpful. So you may, I don't know, turn on the air conditioning. But you get my idea. If you have never ever experienced what you want to be empathetic with, then it becomes really difficult to put yourself into another person's shoes. And this is when I remember my students of Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? So to the extent that I could look and behave like a bat without changing my fundamental structure, my experience would not be anything like the experiences of a bat. I actually would have to become a bat in order to know what it's like to be a bat. So yeah, can we really imagine what it's like a bat? Or in this case, probably if you want to practice empathy, what it's like to be a frog in that situation. And yes, we usually all agree with Thomas Nagel that it is impossible to imagine what it's like to be a bat. But many of us believe it's pretty easy to imagine what it's like to be another human being. But when you really think about it, Mike, do you really know what it's like to be pregnant?
I have some models to go from, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's take the example of delivering a baby.
I've been there a couple times. But no, I take your point, but yeah.
Yeah, but the thing, delivering a baby is actually a funny example, because it's not even for people who have done it, like for instance myself. When my daughter was born, from the time that I thought might be a good idea to go to the hospital now until her first cry. 48 minutes passed. So yes, I have given birth. I know what it's like. However, if somebody would say, oh yeah, she has lived experience, she should design the delivery room in a hospital and calculate like how many people can be funneled through there. So I probably would say, okay, it took me 48 minutes. Well, you know, with our limited resources in the healthcare system, we have to be efficient here, you know. So I probably would say, 48 minutes. Let's be generous. Some people are probably slower. 2.5 hours should be plenty, right? Now you, even though you never have given birth yourself, probably would immediately scream, no, 2.5 hours are not enough. So this whole idea of because I have done something, because I have gone through something, I know what it's like for everybody else is something that is actually deeply problematic. And you can try to put yourself in the shoes of those other people on those pictures here. Now, one thing that I actually noticed when I was Googling images for diversity is something either funny or alarming, depending on how you consider it. When you look at those images, you will see that here you have some very superficial faces, facial expressions, hard to tell. They all kind of look the same. The only thing that really is different between those people is like their hairdo and their skin color. Same here. Here you don't even have faces anymore. And here we just have hands. So seems like only white people are wearing watches. Is that kind of what I'm supposed to learn here? But yeah, it is actually alarming when we are looking at all this diversity training that more and more people are exposed to. We're really only talking about the superficial things that back when I was going to school, we all agreed we should set aside. We shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin or the shape of their hands or stuff like that. We should look underneath. All of that is gone here. Another downside of empathy. Once a victim, it is difficult to break away from the mold. To be sure, a victim holds many advantages. It gives rise to generous government programs, transfer payments in one form or another. It also provides a ready-made excuse if things do not work out. More to the point, being a victim allows people to shirk responsibility. And as we shall see, yes, they do. All too often, government intervention leads to dependence, so that individuals or even communities become dependent on continued government spending and lose their ability to become self-reliant. Now, while this may sound as what is going on with indigenous communities, this was actually somebody who was talking about the treatment of the Acadians in New Brunswick and more generally Francophone Canadians who also went through this victim assignment. And then there's toxic empathy. Empathy is now not the pure act of altruism or cherishing, but the norms that dictate one's tie to a group or a person. So why would that be a problem? When we are expressing empathy with victims, with groups, we always focus on unfairness and injustice that is perpetrated towards a group. And in order to do that best, we have to perceive that group as a monolith. In other words, all members of that group are affected by the injustice. All deserve empathy, and also all are kind of helplessly or helpless recipients of this injustice. And when you think about all those empathy-deserving groups and members of those groups, you can probably, for every single one of those groups, think of members that are actually powerful, that are resourceful, and so on. But if they are just all perceived through this, oh, you deserve empathy, those kind of characteristics are usually neglected. Attempting to put oneself in the shoes of the oppressed people, again, emphasizes the effects that being oppressed would have on oneself. So if I try to empathize with an oppressed person, I have to put myself into their shoes. So again, I have to put myself in the shoes of the person who is delivering a baby, for instance. And I may or may not be able to actually do that. But what I am able to do is to picture what I would do in that situation. So fathers who have been in the delivery room during delivery usually have a much, much more traumatic experience than the mother. Not because they're weak or anything like that, but because they're not going through the experience. They're watching it. They're watching a loved one being in intense pain. Attempts to putting oneself in the shoes of oppressed people very often, for that reason, underestimate the resiliency of oppressed people. So yes, if I would right now be required to live somewhere in one of those homeless encampments, I probably wouldn't last a week. But the people who are living there have a lot of experience with living like that I don't have. And for that reason, I'm not saying we should just ignore them and say, oh, they are doing just fine. But I definitely cannot pretend that I actually know what it's like to be in that situation. And of course, another thing that is pretty problematic is that it also discourages criticism, because how could you possibly criticize a person that is already down? But sometimes constructive criticism is actually something that is very helpful. And here I'm thinking, for instance, that's the situation that we have in British Columbia with the toxic drug crisis. So as long as people are just perceived as victims and we are literally prevented from saying things like, well, maybe they should get treatment. Maybe they should be forced to get treatment. The only thing that really happens is that every year more and more British Columbians die of overdoses of, I cannot even say illicit drugs anymore because they have become legal in British Columbia. Okay, let's look at some examples. So one is the findings of burial sites at residential schools, or the alleged findings of burial sites at residential schools. So that got started, I think it was 3 years ago now, in Kamloops, the residential school. They have uncovered the remains of 215 children buried at the site. First Nations said. They said it hired a specialist in ground-penetrating radar to carry out the work, and its language culture department oversaw the project to ensure it was done in a culturally appropriate, respectful way. The discovery of the remains of 215 children in unmarked graves at the former residential school in Kamloops stunned many Canadians. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the discovery a dark and shameful chapter in our country's history. And of course, again, you are prevented from even critically inquiring about that, because who would do such a thing? Preliminary findings are presented as facts. Now that might have been appropriate when the findings first were reported, but that has been nearly 3 years ago. And so far really no graves actually have been unearthed. Survivors deserve respect, empathy, they deserve our trust. Any work related to the grave sites needs to be done in a culturally appropriate way, and asking questions is disrespectful and reveals a lack of depth.
So Tom Flanagan has no.
We come to that. So yes, there were actually evil people that were after more than a year for the first time voicing concerns. So yes, we have heard there are those grave sites. Are there any bones? Is there anything at all that we could maybe unearth and then bury in a culturally appropriate way to show respect? So far, nothing. And then, of course, there is also the claim residential school denialists. That's a very, very strange term. Nobody denies that residential schools existed. What some people deny is that they were 100% harmful to Indigenous children. So some people claim that not all Indigenous children that were in residential schools have suffered there, that some children actually have had positive experiences and so on. So that is a residential school denialist. It's not a person who denies that the schools existed. That's a little bit misleading. So some of those people tried to dig up suspected unmarked graves in Kamloops. Denialism, it was then claimed, is the last step of genocide. Okay, so again, if you are accused of genocide, you probably just back off. Residential school deniers tried to dig up suspected unmarked grave sites at the former Kamloops residential school, not believing a May 2021 announcement from the First Nation that as many as 215 Indigenous children had been buried there. They entered the site without permission. Some came in the middle of the night carrying shovels. They said they wanted to see for themselves if children are buried there. And those unauthorized visits to the site are the work of the core group of Canadians who continue to deny, defend, or minimize the physical, sexual, psychological, and emotional abuse inflicted on Indigenous children in the residential school system. So again, you have to kind of wonder how somebody who wants to see for themselves the remains of those poor children is guilty of all of those claims. But of course, if they're all thrown at you, then again, you just back off quietly. Other uninvited visitors, including denialists and some members of the media, were disrespectful of the site, breaching cultural protocol and taking videos and pictures without permission.
Christina,
Yeah?
did some people actually come in with shovels in the middle of the night?
Yeah.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah, but I mean, the The grave site is something like if, let's say, down there next to a building, this is where allegedly the remains of those children are, you know. So it's not like that is a graveyard with grave markers where somebody then starts digging. Mm-hmm. It's basically, I actually have seen that residential school in Kamloops, and yeah, there's kind of like a field next to it, so. Okay, how are we actually doing for time? Right. So yes, one can maybe say that that was disrespectful. I'm not really sure how that constitutes ongoing or continued genocide. But the thing is, if you are using this kind of language, you again emphasize that we should have empathy with the First Nations, with the survivors and so on, and that it is entirely inappropriate to question anything that they are telling us. Now compare that to actually the movement in Manitoba, Search the Landfill. The Search the Landfill movement started by the families of Indigenous women that were murdered at the hands of a serial killer in Manitoba. And they are demanding that their loved ones be recovered from Prairie Green landfill. Now, it is believed that 2 of those victims are actually buried there. Or, to put it another way, that the monster who killed them, Skibiki, has dumped their bodies there. There are possibly the remains of 2 additional women also in that landfill. Skibiki at that time had pleaded not guilty to all charges, so he had actually denied. And even if assumed that he is guilty, even if assumed that he has dumped the body somewhere, the back then conservative government of Manitoba deemed that the search of the landfill just wasn't feasible. It's covered with wet, heavy construction clay. There's asbestos, other hazardous material. It's estimated that the 2 women that they do believe are in the landfill were in the landfill for at least 34 days before police were aware of their presence. By then, more than 10,000 truckloads of trash had been heaped upon them. So they may be somewhere in this landfill, but it is extremely difficult to pinpoint exactly where they might be. Still, there was insistence. So again, there was a movement, search the landfill. It is up to us who are alive here and now to make sure that their remains are recovered so they may enter eternal rest and join their ancestors amongst the stars. So that were from the demands of the people who wanted to search the landfill. These women are human beings, they are worthy of dignity and respect. It is up to us. Okay. So they may enter eternal rest, join their ancestors, their families deserve to grieve and embrace them one more time so they might heal. When we honor them, we honor ourselves and our own humanity. All right. Oh, just before I move on here. So we have those 2 very different situations. In Kamloops and by now other former residential schools, we know allegedly exactly where the remains of the children are. But there is nobody asking to dig them up, give them a proper burial, dignity, respect, and so on, bury their remains properly. And if people actually are attempting to do that, they are accused of perpetuating genocide.
Yeah. There was one, I don't remember the details of the tribal name, but there was one in Ontario, wasn't there, that suspected using the same techniques, discovered anomalies in the basement of a church,
Yeah, yeah.
which the chief was absolutely convinced, so he gave permission to dig them up, and it turned out to be no bodies, but rocks. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I dimly recall that, but in Kamloops and in other places in British Columbia, each time when somebody says, why don't we dig up those grave sites and make sure that the children get a proper burial, then the response always is we have to do it in a culturally appropriate way. But
the one that was dug up, when I read the story, I was just convinced that the chief, I did believe he must, you know,
yeah.
that there were bodies down there, and was surprised.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, that's the thing. It wouldn't be surprising if there would be bodies found, considering when all of that happened. That happened at a time when children were dying of all kinds of horrible diseases, when during the winter time, I mean, in Kamloops, it gets brutally cold in the winter time when people were freezing to death. So it wouldn't be surprising, you know. The surprising thing isn't that they claim that they are burial sites. The surprising thing is that they just refuse to actually now confirm. When they claim they know exactly where they are. While in this landfill, where it is extremely difficult to pinpoint whether or not those women actually have been buried there, they insist that we have to dig them up. So
Not unusual in politics, the issue is more important than the truth.
yeah. Now, some recent development in this case was actually something that I found just absolutely horrifying. So the serial killer who is accused of killing at least 4 Indigenous women, he has now admitted to killing those women. However, his defense team has hired a forensic psychologist from the United Kingdom, actually, and this guy claims that he wasn't criminally responsible for his actions. Why not? Well, the psychologist testified Skibicki told him he was encouraged to kill the women by voices he was hearing at the time, and that he also claimed he told police a different story because he'd been overtaken by an entity that could have been either God or the devil, which was speaking on his behalf. So in other words, he was claiming schizophrenia, delusions, psychotic symptoms, and so on. And the defense was therefore arguing he wasn't criminally responsible. The truly mind-boggling thing is not that the defense actually tried that, but there were no protests, there was no outrage, nothing. And it is like, well, it is mind-boggling. If you are really a relative worried about what happened to your children, I mean, you would be up in arms. It would be way more important to make sure that this guy ends up behind bars versus searching the landfill, I would think. But then again, I probably completely lack the ability to put myself into the shoes of those people. Okay, closer to home, closer to the academy. When I last talked about this was obviously a case that was still on the radar of everybody. Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard, who was forced to resign, not because she said those baffling things about context and genocide and that kind of stuff, but because it was found out that she had plagiarized actually quite a bit of her dissertation. And she refused to resign for quite some time, but eventually it was no longer possible to ignore the allegations, so she made a statement for weeks. Both I and the institution to which I've devoted my professional life have been under attack. My character and intelligence have been impugned. My commitment to fighting anti-Semitism has been questioned. My inbox has been flooded with invective, including death threats. I've been called the N-word more times than I care to count. My hope is that by stepping down, I will deny demagogues the opportunity to further weaponize my presidency in their campaign to undermine the ideals animating Harvard since its founding: excellence, openness, independence, and truth. Not a word about that plagiarizing might have been a wrong thing, that it maybe undermines those. And of course, very quickly, there were all kinds of defenders of Claudine Gay. Walter Kimbrough, former president of the historically black Dillard University, said what unfolded at Harvard reminded him of an adage from his mother, a black graduate at the University of California, Berkeley, in the 1950s. As a black person in academia, you always have to be twice, 3 times as good, he said. Actually, not to plagiarize is not requiring that you have to be 3 times as good. It's requiring you to play by the rules everybody else has to play by. There are going to be people, particularly if they have any inkling that the person of color is not the most qualified, who will label them as a DEI hire, like they tried to label her. If you want to lead an institution like Harvard, there are going to be people who are looking to disqualify you. Yes, but she made it darn easy to those people. Here's another nice example that I hope not too many graduate students read. In highly specialized fields, scholars often use similar language to describe the same concepts, said Davarian Baldwin, a historian at Trinity College, who writes about race and higher education. Gay clearly made mistakes, he said, but with the spread of software designed to detect plagiarism, it wouldn't be hard to find similar overlap in works by other presidents and professors. Okay. The problem is not that her language was similar to that of others. It was that she conveniently forgot to mention those others. So that is what citation is all about. You use somebody else's work and then you admit that you did. And there's nothing wrong. We do that all the time. The tool becomes dangerous, he added, when it falls into the hands of those who argue that academia in general is a cesspool of incompetence and bad actors. Why might people have this opinion? I wonder. Then we have John Pellicero, a former interim college president who now works at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics, said instances of plagiarism deserve to be evaluated individually and that it's not always so cut and dried. You're looking for whether there was intentionality to mislead or inappropriately borrow other people's ideas for your work. Or was it an honest mistake? Yeah, this is probably what you would say if you have a first-year student dragged into your office. You would ask, was that an honest mistake? If somebody is preparing their PhD and submitting their PhD, you would expect that they don't make those kind of honest mistakes anymore. That they actually have learned what correct citation is all about. And yes, you can easily find on the internet people who are bragging about their policies to make darn sure that those first-year students don't plagiarize or use things like ChatGPT. This class is designed to improve your writing skills. If you're not writing, you're not improving. Using AI opens up academic honesty issues because it raises the question of whether the work is your work, and also because tools like ChatGPT often taking uncredited material from scholars and writers. Just as Claudine Gay did, by the way. Using AI does not produce reliably accurate results. Has serious negative environmental impacts, in case you didn't know that, and exploits workers from the global south, especially workers in prisons and refugee camps, and workers in Kenya, the Philippines, Colombia, and so on. I don't think I have given my talk about e-cars to this group, but it's pretty much what we're doing when we are resourcing material for electronic cars, but I digress. To be more bluntly, there are thousands of people in the world who would love to be in your position. Now she talks to the students. Getting to be a student at a major US research university with relatively small class sizes and extremely prestigious faculty. Education like this is not available to everyone, and so on. So in other words, there's quite a bit of shaming to students that, by the sounds of it, are in a similar position as little Claudine Gay was when she first entered university. And there is no empathy shown towards them, that they should be maybe treated differently. You are in a position way better than most people, right? Okay, let's get back to what else was said about Claudine Gay, because that is something that probably interests most people here. So Irene Mulway, president of the American Association of University Professors, said she fears plagiarism investigations could be weaponized to pursue a political agenda. There's a right-wing political attack on higher education right now, which feels like an existential threat to the academic freedom that made American higher education the envy of the world. So attacks on academic freedom, right wing. Keep that in mind. For presidents to be taken down like this, it does not bode well for academic freedom. I think it will chill the climate for academic freedom, and it may make university presidents less likely to speak out against this inappropriate interference for fear of losing their job or being targeted. Now, while this might be true, one has to wonder, so how on earth does that all relate to plagiarism? And yes, people were quick to claim that there is an intricate link between conservative outrage and plagiarism charges. And that, well, I mean, the headlines speak for themselves. But it is interesting to note that most of Gay's defenders really didn't talk about whether or not she actually plagiarized. That seemed to be entirely irrelevant. Rather, what was important were the political views of those who criticized her. So the implied message was, if you criticize Gay, you're supporting right-wing ideologues and racists. If you defend Gay, you support black women in academia. And what was even more baffling was that some of the defenders of Gay emphasized that the wife of Bill Ackman allegedly also plagiarized. So Bill Ackman obviously was one of the people that led the charge against Claudine Gay. And so you have to wonder, does it disqualify you from criticizing somebody because you happen to be married to somebody who plagiarized? You would think that either plagiarism is bad, and it's bad no matter who does it, or it's something that, well, maybe his wife also didn't do it intentionally, or, right. Yeah, so allegedly there is a right-wing political attack on higher education right now, which feels like an existential threat to academic freedom. When asked why it is so important to get the story into center-left media, Christopher Rufo actually responded, it gives permission for center-left political figures and intellectual figures to comment on the story and then to do editorials on it. How much academic freedom do we actually have if we only can safely comment on stories that are run by media left of the center? And talking of freedom of speech, I promised at the beginning I will say something about the case in British Columbia. Actually, two parts to that case. The one is the resignation of our former Minister for Higher Education, Selena Robinson. First, there were calls for her resignation when she posted something on Twitter about the instructor from I can cheat. God. Langara College, okay. Yeah. So she had actually on her Twitter account said something to the effect that the comments that this instructor from Langara College made were very troublesome, and the university should consider whether or not this person is actually fit to teach. And so a lot of people were saying this is interference with academic freedom, and especially coming from the Minister for Higher Education. However, that is not what got her fired. What got her fired are those remarks. Those were remarks about the alleged history of Israel, where she compared the land where Israel, the state of Israel, is on now to a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. You know, there were several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy, and so on. So this was considered to be so outrageous by people who defend the state of Palestine or the Palestinians more generally, that it didn't matter that she apologized. It also didn't matter that she agreed to get Islamophobic education. She had to resign. And so it wasn't a voluntary act. The leader of the NDP actually forced her to hand in her resignation. So that definitely doesn't fall then under protected free speech. Now, what did the instructor from Langara actually said? She praised the October 7 attack on Israeli civilians by Hamas, called them amazing, brilliant, and offensive. And she did that during a pro-Palestinian rally outside the Vancouver Art Gallery. And obviously, there were lots of people who attended that rally that took videos and stuff like that. And so there was pressure on Langara to fire her over that. Here is actually her full title. So she was an instructor at the English department and an indigenous curriculum consultant. So she was off her job for a couple of, well, essentially for the remainder of the 23 academic year. But then Langara stated that an investigation by Langara College had found her comments were not clearly outside the bounds of protected expression. So they ruled what she had said at this rally was protected speech. She still got eventually removed from her job. Why was that? You may wonder. Well, in January 2024, she told a crowd at a different rally that she had been reinstated as an instructor without any disciplinary action. It means we won. It means I did nothing wrong. It means none of you are doing anything wrong. That suddenly wasn't protected speech. And while I don't have a lot of sympathy for this woman, I certainly can understand why she must be confused. That she got fired over that. In a letter to students, faculty, and staff, Langara said Knight was allowed to return to work with the expectation she would comply with the college's policies and would take care to ensure any future remarks could not reasonably be interpreted as celebrating violence against civilians. Now, her remarks really, I don't think, do that. The only thing that might be reasonably interpreted that way is to say what she was saying back then didn't celebrate. The employee proceeded to engage in activities contrary to the expectations laid out by the college, and as a result, this employee is no longer an employee of Langara. So,
can I just interrupt? So presumably, in the first instance, she was in some sense warned that what you did is okay, but this is entendu, there's a bit of a problem there. So be careful next time. And this time,
well, I suspect something along those lines, but it also has to be said the first time around. There was a huge outcry. There was a lot of pressure on Langara College, not just from Selena Robinson, but also from outraged parents that essentially said, if this person continues to teach here, we will send our kids somewhere else, that kind of stuff. But Langara College obviously also got a lot of pressure from the supporters of all those Free Palestine. So they were quite in a pickle there. And I think what really happened was they were upset that she essentially told everybody, hey, look, I got away with it. I think that really was what kind of got them upset.
And of course, the institution would have been bound by its own rules of confidentiality that it could not share.
Yeah.
That the original complaint contained a proviso to.
Yes, yes. But I mean, the thing is, from her, if you really try to put yourself into her shoes, I would assume she got told, okay, we did an investigation, you didn't do anything wrong. Because there were no formal, like there was not, Mike knows better about those things than I do, fortunately, like no notice on your file and that kind of stuff. She may have been verbally told, don't do it again, kind of thing, but there was no disciplinary action. And she was under the impression that in a couple of days she would start teaching again. And
So presumably, sort of norms of professionalism were used against her.
yes, yes, in a way that they were not, for instance, in the Claudine Gay case. And so there you have to maybe ask yourself, so she was from what I gather, she was not like a regular instructor, but a part-time instructor, so that may also have played a role, because it's usually a lot harder to get rid of somebody who has tenure. So from the sounds of it, I think she was a pretty young person who worked there part-time, very enthusiastic about her activism and that kind of stuff. And yeah. Okay. Let's just quickly wrap it up now. So again, this kind of superficial empathy that we have been talking about on and off usually is awarded to groups based on criteria such as gender identity, race, ethnicity, poverty, addiction, intergenerational trauma, or being oppressed. When you really think about it, it's a form of stereotyping and racial profiling. Because as that picture that I showed you earlier, all they really look for is, are you a member of one of those groups? Do you look like kind of like that person? They don't really see you as an individual. Group membership makes individuals empathy deserving regardless of all the other characteristics of an individual. So the moment you fall into one of those categories, it doesn't matter what else you have done. So individuals, in a way, are really reduced to their empathy-deserving characteristics. And we have that, unfortunately, a lot nowadays. When you think about each time somebody is celebrated to be like the first transgender politician, and it's not about their accomplishments as politician, it's that they're transgender, something that should be entirely irrelevant. It also, interestingly enough, imposes a strict binary approach. Either you are a member of one of those groups or you're not. That's really all that matters. Creates obviously resentment in people that are not in an empathy-deserving group, but probably have a much tougher life than some of the people who are in an empathy-deserving group. And it undermines motivation. So what should we do? Well, instead of smothering people in superficial empathy, we should offer genuine support, which also includes constructive criticism. So yes, we should be able to tell somebody like Claudine Gay that it is wrong to plagiarize, and offer her maybe a course on how to properly cite. Apparently she never took one of those. Group membership is just one part of other characteristics of an individual. So we always ought to consider the full complexity of an individual that we want to support. And again, it's pretty actually insulting to reduce somebody just to their gender role or to their ethnicity, that kind of stuff. And of course, we should expect within group diversity. What helps one individual may not be helpful for another. So it's not just white people that are a diverse bunch, it's everybody. If something isn't working, stop doing it. So yes, what is going on with dealing with the toxic drug crisis in British Columbia is just horrifying. There's no other word for it. Every year more people die. Every year they are providing more and more of those hard drugs, and they call them safe supply. At the same time, when we are told that no amount of alcohol is safe, not even one glass of beer. That right now we're talking about cigarettes, maybe have a lifetime ban for cigarettes because they're so. So what are young people actually getting out of that message? So cigarettes, horrible, alcohol, horrible, safe supply. Well, small wonder that we have more and more people actually getting into those drugs. Be humble. When you aim at showing empathy, you assume that you know what's good for others. When you ask others what they actually need from you, you admit that you don't know what they need. Okay, and on this happy note, thank you for your attention.
Yes, questions or comments for Christina?
Yeah.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I just asked this. It's probably if a particular sort of ideological or religious disposition has hegemony over the formative institutions of the society, and there an election takes place. And clearly that particular hegemony is voted out of power on the political side. Is it justified for the political side to rework the formative institution or introduce alternative opinions? Can it challenge people's tenure? Is that right? Or do those formative institutions continue? Do they have the right to carry on until the politics can be changed once again?
Okay. In a way that has happened after the wall came down in East Germany. So there was a lot inquiry into the academic institutions, especially of higher education, and there were some people that were immediately tossed out for obvious reasons because they had worked for the Stasi. Then there were also obviously certain fields of inquiry, like socialist economies that just were no longer useful. And so that was not problematic, but what was problematic was that in other areas, like let's say back then I had a degree in marine biology, for instance, and we were told that our education really wasn't worth anything anymore. And I hate to tell you, but marine organisms don't suddenly change just because somebody believes in communism or in capitalism. So those things were pretty problematic. And a lot of the East German institutions were then overrun with kind of like second, third, fourth-rate academics from the West that saw an opportunity to get a job that they would never have gotten in the West. So that was pretty dramatic. And yes, it would be hopeful that we can learn from history and avoid those kind of
I
things.
suspect it would be very difficult, even if if political power were to change hands, and you have a conservative government or right or left, that it would be very easy to change the nature of the universities, the schools, and that sort of thing. Just
Well, I mean,
the reaction against that would be so intense on the cultural side.
well, yeah, and here there's a huge difference here from what we had in East Germany. In East Germany, also the political part of education was imposed top down. Here, a lot of it is actually from the
Middle out, anyway.
yeah.
Augie, if you have to leave, did you want to ask a question?
No, I don't have to leave, but I will ask a question. Just scroll back. Just there's a slide. It's near the end. I'm just wondering.
Okay.
It might actually be that last slide. I just want to.
That one?
No, okay, maybe it's. I can't find it right away. One more. Oh, doesn't matter. So it's actually a question of nomenclature, and I wonder. I think there's some accuracy to what you're describing, but I wonder if empathy is the right term to capture that. So three things about my experience with sort of empathy. So I think about so my training is as an ethnographer, and you would know this better than I do, but the notion of verstehen is it's fundamental to what. So that's one moment in which I'm plotted up against an empathetic understanding.
Yeah.
I also have a graduate degree in counseling, so the empathetic moment is central to the therapeutic experience. And what's central about those two moments of empathy is that it's an interactional effect in which people willingly get together to try and understand one another. The things that you're describing, I don't think empathy captures that. There is something about identification. There is something about outrage. There is something about your discussion of stereotypes. That has some accuracy, or it feels closer to what the term is. But I'm wondering if empathy farming is the
So probably I should have said something like hijacking empathy.
Yeah, there's something.
Because in a way, what I'm trying to get at is, as I said in the beginning, obviously empathy, we think it's a good thing. And so if you, like for instance with Claudine Gay, come on, she's a black woman in academia. It was so horrible for her to get there and all that kind of stuff. So you want to feel empathy, sympathy, whatever for her. And anybody who resists that is kind of seen as a bad person. And yes, so I probably shouldn't call it empathy.
There's something, there's a somebody's not getting an empathetic impulse correct.
So
there's and that's my observation.
Okay. Thank you. That helps.
Chris, do you have something to ask?
I think other than very much enjoyed it, Christina, thanks, but I can't think of anything.
No, I'm just, thank you. There's a lot there to think about. There's a lot there to chew on, let me tell you.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, and I'm in sympathy with Augie's suggestions. I certainly think that you can perceive and respond appropriately to injustice without an empathetic connection. right? If someone is being cheated, I don't have to draw on how it feels to be cheated. To have an emotional response and then try to do something about it. The cases that you mentioned, I don't think are quite like observing an injustice and reacting to it. There does seem to be something about bringing a connection into it. But it's your skepticism about empathy that I want to question. And maybe I have in mind sympathy, and
Right, yeah.
my emotional life is totally dark to me. I don't know any of this stuff. But I know what it's like, and I'm not happy with that phrase, but I think I understand. So I know what it's like to be frustrated, especially when I be frustrated by someone intentionally intending to frustrate me when I hold my goals to be appropriate in one way or another. Now, why can't I see that easily in some other case, a case that doesn't involve me, and in identifying with the person whose reasonable or appropriate attempt to attain a fine goal is being intentionally interfered with, think, well, I know what that's like. Even if the goal is not one that I share, the means are ones that I wouldn't use even if I had that goal. So all those other things could be different, but there's this abstract structure. And it's enough that I've been in concrete cases that are instances of this abstract structure for me to have that empathetic response.
Sure, but I mean, that is not really what I'm denying. What I'm questioning is how well you actually get it in concrete cases concerning other people. So let's take, like, I have an easier time with concrete examples. So let's assume you're driving down, I don't know, Spring Garden Road and somebody cuts you off. So if you are like me, you're pretty pissed off. Other people are rather chill about it. You know, so just me seeing another person being cut off doesn't mean that I actually know what it's like to be cut off for that other person. But we all have that tendency to assume that everybody is just like us, regardless of how many instances we experience that other people actually aren't like us. So my default always would be to assume that this other person is just as pissed off as I am. They may be like 90% as pissed off as me, they may be 10%. I really don't know, unless I know that person very well, that kind of stuff. And what I'm trying to get at is when we are doing those kind of exercises, especially like this EDI training and that kind of stuff, we pretend that we know what it's like for other people, when in fact, we very often don't have a clue.
Okay, yeah. Bill, a second question?
Well, yeah. To go back to the indigenous example you gave. I mean, it's people are really being accused of not having empathy. I mean, if we agree that empathy is generally a good characteristic, or to be empathetic is a good characteristic, and like I have a friend at West who taught at the in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba for a long time. And he had recently written critically about the residential school's reputation and so on and so forth, and taken a beating for being not empathetic.
Yeah.
But he actually began his teaching career in residential schools. married an indigenous woman. He had, they have two children. I mean, I suppose you could say, if you wanted, if that is important to you, or mixed race children. And his really anger is about the divisiveness. He said,
yes.
my wife, attended residential school. She always said, I went to an Anglican school. That was her view of a residential school, and she was quite proud of it. So he really, I mean, you can almost steal empathy out of the past and inject it into the present in a way that is not very sympathetic toward people whose background you know nothing about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's in a way what I find so frustrating about this whole thing, is that we are now at a point where people that, I mean, like most Canadians are pretty chill. And when we are told, so what happened in the residential schools was a bad thing, most people accept that and say, yeah, sorry, can we move on? But if you continue to do stuff like that, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to claim that the people that went there to that gravesite or alleged gravesite that they had good intentions. I have no idea, But to claim that somebody who goes there and wants to see whether there are really children buried or not is committing genocide is... something doesn't fit.
That was the point. That's what reminded me of my friend's story, because when Mark asked that, somebody really went to dig it up. Well, people were angry enough because they felt it was a lie. And a lie that was generating a great deal of unnecessary division in their society. And they could get angry enough to say, well, come on, let's have the truth. If the truth is there's graves there.
But it's not just moxie, that was idiocy. I mean, there's nothing that nothing good could have come of
it. Wouldn't be something I would do, but I can empathize with
wanting to know,
with people wanting to know and desperately wanting to say, listen, the Canadian flag has been in a half-mast for 6 months.
There's no evidence.
Well, I mean,
you may be married to an Indigenous person who says, no, that didn't happen.
But I mean, it's really the contrast between the reluctance of even entertaining the idea of digging there. I mean, it's not that somebody else should. A lot of people said, why are not the Indigenous people doing it in the appropriate ways, that kind of stuff, When on the other hand, you have at the landfill where you say we have to dig those bodies up so they actually can get peace and dignity and all of that, it's like, so those two are complete opposites.
I wanted to make a point about that, Christina. These are different people. It's not like there's some one person whose attitudes are totally different in relevant cases. But and as Bill pointed out, there are some Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders who do want that the hypotheses be explored, and that there be attempted exhumations, or at least in the church case to find out. But the one case involves a specific subset of Indigenous people from a particular band in British Columbia, and the other concerns relatives of murdered women. So I think it's hard to say, they want something here, but they don't want it there, when these are different.
No, they are very different.
But see, now you already do something that I actually advocate for. You see Indigenous people as individuals that may have entirely different life stories. But when we are told about, like, for instance, the residential school experience, there is this one Indigenous person that is kind of like in those pictures that I showed you, that essentially is kind of like a faceless somebody with like red skin or something like that, and maybe a feather sticking up. And that is what I'm opposing, you know. And when you say, yes, they can have different opinions, then you already concede that they're not all the same.
Last question for Christina.
It's a half-baked thought, so it's not a question.
Last half-baked thoughts for Christina?
It seems, so if I go back to my sort of question of nomenclature and this idea of empathy and whether that's the right term, it seems that sort of behind the dynamics that you're unpacking, I'll call it a cultural moment, I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a moment at which we have privileged experience over a range of other things that we dichotomize that with. So I'm going to say objective stuff. It's like there's something bigger beyond there, and the bugaboo may not be empathy, but the way in which experience has become privileged or prioritized. And I wonder what the history of that is. And that's my half-baked thought. That's
right. And I mean, there is now this wide shared belief that in order to understand, let's say, what it's like to be a black person in a lecture hall, you have to be a black person. Like a teacher like Mike could not possibly understand what his black students go through. And yes, on one level, that's obviously true, you know, but on another level, it presupposes that all the black people that went through university essentially had the same experience. Yeah. And that is what I deny, you know. And I mean, nobody would believe that, like, all the male white students that ever went through St. Mary's had a similar experience as Mike did. You know, and I'm not sure that all of them kind of like saw themselves in Mike because he was a teacher and that kind of stuff. And that seems to be perfectly fine, but when it comes to women or when it comes to members of other races and stuff like that, suddenly we need this kind of like almost figurehead, you know, and to me that in a way is weird.
Last comment then before we end, Christina? Do you have a last thought?
Oh, me. Thank you very much for your questions and for putting up with the seat here.